Thank you very much for joining us today in this webinar series from the Design Management International at the Hochschule Luzern. Felix Gugler is going to be sharing his experience with us. Felix is a graduate from our program. He graduated in 2021. He then went to Finland to do his master in Design Business Management at Aalto University in collaboration with Berkeley, California. And he has experience working in innovation teams and startups. And he has been involved into corporate startup collaboration as a venture client led of Combient Foundry. So he is going to be sharing what he's doing and what is his experience, and also a little bit for our students, what happened from graduation to professional life. So thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you back. And whenever you are ready, if you want to share screen or say something, the floor is yours.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks so much. And I see also some familiar faces as participants. Sadly, I cannot see you actually, but I know that some of you hopefully are listening and all of you are in the Zoom meeting. Yeah, it's really a pleasure. Just maybe as a brief sentence before, I really enjoyed the time at design management. So those of you who are still students, make sure to enjoy it to the most. Yeah, and today I will be talking a bit what I did after during my studies and then also after my studies, uh, what I'm doing today and why I think it's important, and then what are the skills required to work in such a role that I'm working in. Yeah, so giving you a bit of a perspective of what working life can be like, because I also remember design management can be very multidisciplinary, so it was quite vague for me to understand what could I be doing after my studies. And I hope that one perspective is the path that I chose, going more from design to a business school and then working in the corporate startup collaboration environment. And I brought a few slides to kind of show this a bit more. Let's see if that works. Can you see this? I think it should
Yes,
work.
it does.
Yeah. So today I will share my alumni perspective from a student to the venture client environment. Yeah, so it all started, I think, where most of you are right now or have been before, in Luzern or in Emmenbrücke at Bachelor in Design Management. Um, I have to say that during my studies, I was working a lot, like around 60% in other organizations, for example, in Get Abstract, MDPI, and then also a startup called Sparkable that a friend of mine co-founded with a few others. And then after my bachelor's, I was really thinking I would like to continue a bit of academic education, because I also knew that in the long term, the positions that I would like to be in, all of the people that were in those positions, they have either master's degree or even doctoral degree. So I knew that that would be a profile required. And I was also just curious to continue studies, and I wasn't ready to fully be in the working life, because maybe it's also because I had been working next to my studies for most of the time already. So I went abroad. I completed 2.5 years of studies in Finland, so in Aalto University, actually the Master of Science in Economics and Business Administration. So that was really nice because, as many of you will find out, with a Bachelor of Arts, it's quite tricky to get sometimes into Master of Science. So just for those of you who are students, Aalto is one of the on university that really embraces this interdisciplinary education. And it doesn't matter as much what you did in your bachelor's, as long as you fulfill some of the requirements and just show a lot of motivation and dedication. And it's still a very reputable school. I also got there the chance to go to UC Berkeley for a few credits, and that was really when I got super interested in the corporate startup collaboration and the startup ecosystem as a whole. And I also did some studies at the University of St. Gallen, which it was more about AI and business strategy. And I think all of these things together kind of showed me the value of interdisciplinarity. Then also going abroad, I think it's if you have the chance to do guest studies or work abroad, I would highly recommend it because a lot of this was also building a new network, finding new friends, um, accommodating different cultural differences. And that's a huge, I think, a valuable skill to learn and an area of growth as well. And then after this academic kind of like next to this, I was still working also as a product lead and as an advisor to startups. So I never really stopped working. Um, yeah, in hindsight, maybe I would have liked to focus even more on my studies, but it's also I've always kind of been working, so it just came naturally to me. And then after this, I started as an intern at Combient Foundry. And since then, I've been working there as a venture client lead. And we have offices in Helsinki, Stockholm, and Palo Alto. I'm mainly working from the Helsinki office, which is our biggest one as well. And venture client lead, I'll talk a bit more what that means. It's yeah, it doesn't really mean that much if you don't know anything about venture clienting or corporate startup collaboration. So maybe first a bit why this work is important in my opinion. So a startup, so why do startups matter to address the big challenges that we're facing, and why do corporates kind of struggle and how do they come together? So corporates, they are the backbone of a lot of our economy. So they create a lot of value. And they are really also, on one side, responsible for a lot of good, but they are also responsible for a lot of the emissions that we are causing, a lot of the problems, social problems that we are facing. But they are really also the companies who have the resources, the reach to actually change things in the big scheme. But they are quite slow to change. A lot of companies are still, for example, in sustainability, a lot of companies are only now reporting on their sustainability targets, and so it takes many, many years for them to change. And on the other hand, startups, so small companies with, for example, between 1 and 200 employees, like developing a new technology or a product or a new service, they are they are quite different from corporates. They are fast, they are really focused on solving a specific problem. They can even solve like very societal problems, for example, or very tangible problems. And they're really purpose driven. And they also attract very different people than in the corporates. Because if you're looking to make a change within 2, 3 years, you're most likely going to work in a startup environment. Because in the corporate, it just takes so much more time. So it's really two different worlds. But our hypothesis has always been that sustainability and transformation, we need to all work together. And as our organization, so Combient Foundry, we really focus on the two stakeholders, so corporates and startups. Now, there are many other stakeholders as well, which need to work together, like NGOs, public entities, trade organizations, and even people just as consumers, for example. But we really focus on how can we enable these large, very huge companies that influence a lot of our economy and the startups, so the kind of change makers and the emerging technologies, the technologies of the future, how can they work together? So that's exactly what we do or what I do as well in my job. It's really making corporate startup collaboration work because on paper it might seem very easy. Okay, there's a company and a startup, why can't they just work together? But in practice, because they are so different, it it's not so easy for them to work together. Um, so what does this mean? So we always, what I do on a day-to-day basis is really, and that's very close to what we did at Design Management International as well. First, it starts by defining the problems where it makes sense to work with startups. And that's almost half of the work is already getting to those problems. Because I think it's still taught in the studies that defining the problem, that's already worth spending almost half of your time on. Because if you have a really valuable problem that has a huge potential in terms of adding societal value, sustainability value, and also economic value, then it's really worth spending more time on that. And we work with a number of large organizations like AstraZeneca or Kone, which is a main competitor of Schindler. I know some of you have worked with Schindler before, or then Scania, which is a truck manufacturer. So with a lot of these industrial companies, we help to define where does it make sense to work with startups and with external solution providers. Then we identify, so we scout for the relevant startups, for example, online using AI tools that we have developed to scan through hundreds of thousands of companies and identify really the relevant partners for each problem. And then lastly, what we do is really help the company and the startup set up pilots. So a pilot project that creates real business value. And that's, I think, also something that we learned a bit in the studies. It's not worthwhile to create a whole theory and a plan and an action plan for what you're going to do. It's most important is to start small and really test things out and then build something, measure it, and then learn what needs to be improved before you scale something. Because quite often, if we don't start with a pilot, so we start with a huge project, the risk is super high. So it's very important to start with a small pilot at first. And throughout this whole process, we really focus on a win-win collaboration. So for the startup, the win is that they gain one of the biggest European companies as an early pilot customer. So that's something they can show on their website. Hey, we have worked with AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca has worked with us, and that proves that their technology is really among the best in the world. And they also get early revenue because for a startup, it's quite important to get first customers, to get more investment or to get follow-on, to show traction to investors and also to get even more customers. And what's also important for us is that it's not really about wild ideas and crazy thinking, because a lot of people, when they think of innovation, they only think of the disruptive and flying cars or things like that. But it's really about tangible problems with real people that you can solve by fostering collaboration across these two different worlds, so the startup and the corporate world. Now, the last thing that I'm going to briefly mention is we were talking about in preparation for this session, what are the skills needed? And I remember that you have developed this wheel of skills, I think, with a lot of different colors. I don't know how much you use it in the study, but I was thinking myself, what are the skills that I think are required in my job today? And I didn't cross-reference it with your skills, so these are just from my own words. But first one is really understanding. So, and also kind of digging deeper. Because quite often when a company comes to us with a problem, they might not have asked the five whys from IDEO, for example. Like they might not have really questioned their own problem. So it's about understanding and digging deeper, asking questions to really understand what is the actual problem we need to solve here. Because if you jump into solution mode too quickly, you might end up solving the wrong problem, for example. So there, it's very important to listen, to perform active listening, to be able to facilitate productive workshops, to really unravel a topic. So first part of this is about people, but then also understanding is super crucial because we might be working with some of the most advanced technologies that are existing in the world. So it's really important to spend some time even if you're not an engineer, kind of understanding the engineering behind each of these technologies. Because these problems that we are working on are can be quite technical in some instances. So you need to put in some work into really understanding what you're working with. Then the second one is really thinking creatively. So even though we have very concrete problems, there's often very different ways you could solve a problem. So there might be five different technologies that can be used to solve the same problem. And some of these technologies, they might never have been used in this way. So sometimes it's about repurposing something or using something in a way that no one else has thought it could be used as. So it's really about connecting the dots that others are maybe not able to see. And this is especially important for the companies. Because let's say Scania, they produce trucks. So they will only view the world through trucks, like whatever is truck related. They will not see what's outside of the trucking world. So I have to enable them to think creatively and to see possibilities that are outside of what they typically would look at. The last one is bridging, or the next one is bridging worlds. So it's really about kind of being in the middle of highly specialized technology um, stakeholders, the business requirements. So what is the problem you're trying to solve from a business perspective? Then also design, so really using design methods, using the design approach as well to really understand the problem, and ultimately people. You always have to keep in mind what are the people's needs, what are their motivations, have they been struggling with this? Are they understanding what we are saying? So it's really about these four elements coming together. And then also the two worlds of corporate and startup. That's maybe more obvious. So these two worlds where the startups are usually young teams, very motivated, very fast, very ambitious. And then the corporates, they are a bit more laid back. They have been in this career for 15 years. The world moves a bit slower. So bringing those two together and enabling them to shine together, that's a huge skill. And the last one is so really network thinking. So thinking what can create most value for everyone and who can create this value together. And here the concept of shared value creation is also super important because quite often it's about creating something that can only be created by two people working together. So each of these alone wouldn't be able to do it, but together they can do it. So really identifying these possibilities is a very important skill in this work environment. Yeah, I think this already wraps up the first 20 minutes that I was told I should take for this. Um, I've been talking a lot now, and I know it was maybe a bit fast in certain moments, but happy to answer some questions as well if there are some, and
We have
also
already
more detailed.
one question. Yes, thank you, Felix. So we have already a question from Cecilia. Do you see the question?
Yeah, so I would love to hear an example how you've experienced the collaboration between corporate and a startup. Yes, um, so I'm thinking if that should be how concrete that should be, but I mean typically, so one project I was working on, for example, was SKF is a company, they produce very big, uh, very big ship engines. So if you look at the container ships, they have the engine in the bottom in the water or the turbine in the water, propelling the ship forward. And um, they wanted to measure something in that turbine with a very specific sensor. Then, for example, I identified five different technologies that could be used to measure that data point, and identified 100 different startups. Then we went through a selection process, and in the end, they chose one company that could really supply this measurement. And then what we do is we set up a collaboration between these two companies. For example, in this context, it meant that the startup would get access to some of the company's prototypes and be able to test their technology in a prototype within 4 months. And then after these 4 months, the technology could be scaled up if it was successful, or maybe there would be a second test if it wasn't successful. So that's a very practical example. Maybe it's too detailed, but usually it's really about it's a startup that has maybe 50 people. They have a very specific, very interesting technology, and they are looking for a company that would be willing to try that technology out because they have maybe only been working at the university or in labs or only creating prototypes, but at some point they need to create a real working product. And that's usually where the collaboration comes in, basically, that the company provides this risk of, okay, you get to try out the technology. And the benefit is that if it works, the company gets to purchase it or gets to license it for a better price than maybe the second customer will. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
We have a second question. I don't know if you want to move to the second question or wait for
Yeah.
Cecilia to clarify if the answer.
Maybe we can do both. So Cecilia, if there's any other follow-up questions, just let me know. And then there's a few other questions.
He said yes, it helps. So we
Okay,
can
great.
go. Yeah,
Yeah, so
super.
John, nice to hear from you again.
Yeah.
He was actually studying also with me. I know he's in Africa quite often, so
Mhm.
wondering where he's dialing in from. Um, how far does our involvement go? What does the role look like when they are working together? So when the company and the startup decide to work together, some of our companies, they have dedicated project management resources to facilitate a pilot project, to scale this up. And some companies, they ask us to really help them along the whole process. Because actually the most difficult part and the part where it gets really complex is when they actually test out the solution. Because then it's not about meetings anymore. It's about technology. It's about putting a physical sensor onto a machine and looking at the data for 3 months. So it gets really much more complex because also you start involving a lot more resources because it costs a lot of money some money to test this. You involve a lot more people and it gets more real because it and so we usually provide the best practices for that. But also in cases where the company thinks it's really valuable to have us there, we can even give a person that is there and helps them, for example. We had cases where we even had a person going to the factory in Singapore to look after the collaboration and really make sure it succeeds. But it's really up to the project and up to the company how how important it is to them that this succeeds, or how confident they are that they can succeed with or without our help. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
And we have one more question from Marcel. I have questions too, but let's first go with the guest.
Yeah, so maybe I need to ask for some clarification. So Marcel asked if I can give some estimate,
Hmm?
guess on how much effort there must be to keep the unequal liaison going on average. Um, so I'm not sure if this is so how much effort. So I think it really depends. The short answer is it does take effort. Like collaboration will not happen on its own. So that's also why it's so important that we in the beginning select a problem that is really important. Because if it's a really important problem that gives a lot of societal sustainability and business value to the company if it's solved, then the company will also be willing to put in more effort into actually making the collaboration a success. So in that sense, the effort is really about before you even set up a project, making sure it's really relevant, it has high potential, it's important that you find out who are the people who really want this problem to be solved. So the users. It's also important to get the buy-in from management that this problem should be solved, and you have the resources to solve it together with the startup. Um, but yeah, on average, it really depends on each project. Like some tests, they might involve one small factory for 3 months and a team of 2 people, but it can also be that it's something that involves 10 people, for example, over a few months. It can even be that it's just a small software that can be tested out in 1 week, requiring only one person. So it really depends basically.
I have two questions. You were talking about technical problems, and later you talk about human problems. When you start this collaboration process, can you really separate the two type of problems?
No, I mean, like on a technical level, yeah, so it really depends. Some problems are really these engineering problems. Let's say
Hmm.
putting a sensor into a machine, that's
Yeah.
very much engineering driven. But let's say if it's about digitalizing worker training, let's
Hmm.
say factory workers, they want training. It begins to be much more blurry because you start to have a lot of users or a lot of different stakeholders.
Yeah.
So that's when the design perspective becomes much more important
Hmm.
because you cannot simply just put a sensor into the machine, make
Hmm.
the technical details work, and be happy with it, but you have to
Yeah.
think which solution will be accepted by users.
Hmm.
How can what might be the users' motivations? Which startup can really, which startup also does follow a design approach? Because
Hmm.
we are not the ones who will be implementing all of this. It's mostly going to be the startup and the corporate.
Yeah.
So the more um, people are involved in this, the more
Mhm.
of a people problem it is.
Yeah.
And also ultimately innovation, the goal of this is always to adopt innovation into the company.
Hmm.
External innovation that has been produced to not do it yourself, but really use all of those talents that are
Hmm.
available to your and everyone's advantage.
Yeah.
And this adoption is a very human process as well, because quite
Hmm.
often it's not about that the people like people also maybe are resistant to change or they fear that this they might be arrogant also. Some of the corporates they might think we have been here for 100 years, we must be doing something right.
Hmm.
So why should we trust in a startup that is just 5 years old or 3 years old?
Hmm.
There it's a lot about education, uh,
Trust.
trust, yeah, building trust,
Yeah.
showing successes, building momentum over time.
Hmm.
Um, and these are all very human things.
Yeah. I would say for me, adoption is a human problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a different question, and I will put it in the chat, but the chat for everyone. I don't know if everyone sees and relates to. So in Switzerland, for example, and I'm very curious to see um, what happened in Finland. More and more, we are having ideas like degrowth, and I put the link of the next degrowth conference in Switzerland. And so these all new economics models are taking place. And I put the definition. So we consider that reducing resource use is necessary to enhance ecological vitality. And the movement questions economic growth and Western lifestyle. Is this course in Finland? And is it in the corporate world or have not yet arrived?
Yeah, so the question is about degrowth and its
Yeah.
yeah, so I think the concept is very far away from the corporate world because the corporate world is not about degrowth, it's ultimately about growth. And the theories about degrowth, I looked at it a bit in my master's. I had some courses about it. I think where the companies are now is more about circularity. So that could, but circularity actually means also growth, right? So
Mhm.
circularity doesn't really have anything to do with degrowth. It's more enabling the same growth, but enabling it in a sustainable way. I think that's where most companies are.
Mhm.
And it, again, because companies move very slowly,
Mhm.
it will take a lot of time because even now, for example, with the recent geopolitical changes,
Yeah.
even sustainability has again dropped a bit on the agenda.
Yeah.
It is um, not in my company, but I've heard a lot of companies dealing with sustainability that they have seen customers cancel projects, quit
Mhm.
projects, because they have other priorities right now.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think degrowth will be a distant priority for
Mhm.
companies.
Yeah. And what do you think it could be done to help these organizations? Because it should not be understood like business no, right? So it's a new mindset. What could help these organizations? You help these organizations work with startups so that they acquire innovation. In terms of economics, this is considered innovation. So what would be necessary for these organizations to start also adopting degrowth and donut economy and other new economic models that are appearing?
Hmm. I mean, I think to a large extent, for example, the topics it I think first of all it takes time. It takes also constant pressure. It
Hmm.
takes incentives
Yeah.
that are aligned because
Hmm.
it's we have to keep in mind that the people making the decisions in these large organizations,
Yeah.
they didn't get there because they focused on degrowth.
Hmm.
They got there because they focused on growing the company for
Hmm.
20 years
Yeah.
successfully, and they are now making all the decisions in those companies.
Hmm.
Same with shareholders of these. Many of these are publicly listed companies.
Yeah.
But the shareholders, they don't really benefit if the stock decreases in value.
Yeah.
The pension funds who have invested in these companies, they don't benefit if the stock decreases in value. So
Hmm.
I think those are some very fundamental conflicts of interest, and that's also why I think the degrowth will take a lot of time, and yeah, it will take a lot of time. And I think the cool thing is that startups often maybe come with a fresh perspective,
Hmm.
and there are many more startups who are focusing,
Hmm.
let's say, on degrowth, on sustainability, and they're starting to be investors who do invest into degrowth companies and who do see that in the long run, if we don't look at only economic prosperity, but also social and environmental prosperity, investing in degrowth is important. So basically, I do think that degrowth will not come from the corporates, but it will come from policymakers, from
Hmm.
governments, and from startups. That will be the initial push.
Great. We have two more questions, one from Cecilia and another one from Jorge.
Yeah. So who determines which problems receive attention, and what is the decision-making process behind this? So there are a few different ways. There's, of course, the optimal way, and there's the reality of company politics. So maybe the reality in many cases is that it's someone finds this problem relevant. They are maybe also high up in the organization, so they have a lot of budget. They say, I want this problem to be solved. Can we try it? And that's the more unstructured way, where in some cases we just go with it. But we also have very structured ways to, for example, have workshops with 10, 15 people from a company from a specific area of their business to make a long list of 20 different problems that we could focus on and then really prioritize which have the biggest impact, which are most feasible. So that's a very structured approach that we would identify the five most important problems to focus on in the next 6 months, and then start those projects based on a long list and then a short list of problems and then a final selection. And that's how we like to do it, how we want to do it in most cases. But again, in these big companies, there's a lot of dynamics going on as well. Yeah, so that's something you have to keep in mind, that you cannot always just do it the proper way. Sometimes you have to see it more as a that's how it is, and do the best you can with even not the most important problem. Yeah, and ultimately there's another perspective is to look at it from where does the problem come from. So there's the top down. So let's say the senior management say generative AI is super important right now. Look at generative AI and how it impacts our sales team, or look at generative AI, how it impacts our manufacturing teams. That would be top down. And the bottom up is really comes from specific people having a specific problem that they haven't been able to solve themselves, or it has taken them a lot of money to solve it, or they don't have the money to solve it, or they have failed repeatedly at solving it. And ideally, it's a mix of, like, both of these have really unique advantages and disadvantages. With top down, the cool thing is that it's quite an important problem to someone high up in the organization. The difficult thing is that adoption doesn't come from a manager or a senior manager saying this is important, but someone, the one facing the problem, has to adopt the change. And the opposite is with the bottom up. So sometimes these problems are so small that they are not relevant enough to put resources into solving. But when they are important problems, it's really quicker to solve them because you already have a very specific person who has the problem right now, who wants it to be solved. And that's the most important thing to have, is that it's a real problem.
Long question from Jorge.
Okay, what is the question here? What would advice? Okay.
Would you have for the DMI students?
Uh, I mean, just general advice. I think just don't, like, try out things, and don't be like putting a lot of effort into exploring things, do things next to your studies, um, and yeah, treat the whole. I know you don't use the design process anymore, but use your career kind of as a process as well of exploring and testing, iterating. I think that's a
We do use
universal.
design process. We don't use a double
Double
diamond.
diamond, yeah, that, not that
Yeah,
one.
but
You use
they
more.
create their own design process.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
create your own design process for your
Yeah.
career, um, but also don't be afraid to just try things out. I think it's always easier said than done. I also sometimes feel a bit perfectionist, or I want to make sure everything is really good that I have put my time into. But looking back, you rarely can predict if something will be very good or not before you have tried it. So.
And then he said, much of what you are presenting implies skills that are not a specific course content at the Design Management International program. How could students develop some of these important non-academic skills?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think just um, you use a bit of creativity as well.
Mhm.
Like, if a teacher asks you to do an assignment and you are not motivated to do it, find something in the assignment that is relevant to you and focus on that, and still create, like, see every assignment or every course as an opportunity to learn something. And it sometimes you may learn what the course wants you to learn, but sometimes you can learn something a little bit different as well. And I think the most important is to, um, first of all, you also need time to develop these skills. So
Mhm.
you don't need to rush it. For example, I studied in total 5.5 years So I did not only do a bachelor, I also did master. And I also did a lot of internships, not non-academic, how's it called? Like study association work, mentoring, advisory work, um, trying out my own startup once. So you just try different things, and that's how you build the skill set.
Felix, you mentioned a lot try out. Um, Try out, I think that requires also a lot of other skills like courage, confidence.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's yeah, that's a very it's yeah, it's maybe something that I had more naturally.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's yeah, it's a important skill. I think especially in the environment where I work in,
Yeah.
it's quite important. But then again, this is also one environment. In another environment, you might be being a bit more cautious and less experimental,
Hmm.
is more advantageous. So
Hmm.
it's not a must to be very bold and ambitious and try out new things all the time. But
Hmm.
I think it's a good way to test things out before you commit to them.
Yeah, but I think it's a very valuable thing for the students. How do you go about trying out?
Yeah, so I mean, ideally, I think it's really about so trying out something shouldn't be just going with the flow. And
Hmm.
I mean, it's not like you go to a restaurant and you just try the menu. It's more like I think ideally you treat it a bit like a testing scenario as well. You define like what would you like to learn? What are the things you want to measure in this test a bit? Like what is your assumption? What is your hypothesis before this? And even though maybe sometimes it's a bit tedious, but I think a lot of it is tracking the learning,
Hmm.
tracking your reflection. That's important in trying something out. Yeah, because yeah, what was it? Yeah. Even in yeah, because there's a big difference between a really a test, like trying out something, and just kind of doing
Explore.
random things. Yeah. And I
Mhm.
think there's benefit in both, but yeah, I
Yeah,
think they should be complementary to each other.
super. And we haven't finished with Jorge's questions. And he said the topic of sustainability is a big topic. Where is the trip going? Can you say a few words on what sustainability means in the corporate and startup context? Where do you see the topics in sustainability going? What are firms working on?
Yeah. I I mean, it's a very important topic. Even if I said that it's had a bit of a dip recently,
Hmm.
it's still for most companies or for all companies, it's important and also for the people. I think for many people, they have realized that it's important to them personally, even if in the short term, sometimes it is difficult to focus on that because they have to make sure the company survives, for example, in even when there's tariffs or when there's um, a recession. And so what they are, I think some topics that all of them are working on is materials, so different materials for producing something with less emissions, for example. Then also just digitalization across the supply chain and AI. So first you need to digitalize, then you can have big data and then AI on top of that. And then there's a lot of efficiency gains, let's say with energy consumption or with waste water. Like so the efficiency, that's something that all of them are doing because also usually energy is energy actually has associated costs. So it is financial value. And then a lot of companies are looking into circularity, but it's still quite early on and more like pilots and early stage projects. And I think in the manufacturing context, the topic of remanufacturing is, for example, very closely related to circular economy. So it would then be that companies operate not anymore as a pure factory, but more like a factory and a repair shop at the same time. That you buy, let's say you don't buy one product, but you buy that you always have a product, and if it breaks, you get a new one, and they can refurbish the old one.
Yeah.
Um, that's what a lot of our companies are working on.
Patagonia maybe is a good example of that.
Yeah, for example.
So that they offer the product and services that go into repair.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that might be also a model to take to the degrowth.
Yeah, because ultimately you might be, yeah, you don't have 10
Hmm.
jackets anymore, or not 10 jackets are produced, but only one, and it's repaired, and so that way you have 10 times less jackets in the world. So,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
still the same profits. I mean, I think that's sadly, or not sadly, but that's business is always gonna be about financial sustainability as well. So, yeah.
Yes. There is no one without the other. You mentioned also collaboration, and that is absolutely a human skill. We were talking yesterday with some of the students doing the graduation project on the topic of collaboration with one of the teachers. And one of the difficulties when collaborating is meeting the realities of someone else. So you work in collaboration. What are the skills that you use there that are different, in my view, from working in teams and assigning roles? And so this is your role, this is my role. This is bringing people together that have very different value systems, perhaps, belief, intentions, purpose. And that is the meeting of different realities that make collaboration a very interesting space, but also a challenging space. How
Yeah.
do you go about that beautiful space?
Yeah, I think like us, we are facilitators of this collaboration.
Yeah.
And I think one job we have, or what we do, is really reduce uncertainties.
Hmm.
So first of all, really clarifying what does the company want. And then on the other side, really clarifying what does the customer want, but then also on the other side, what does the startup offer?
Hmm.
And what do they want out of the collaboration? So that means, for example, for the startup, we ask them 10, 20 questions, have calls with them to understand what they offer. The same with the companies. We have several workshops to really narrow down the problem, understand it. So reducing uncertainty, I think that's a baseline, because if you go in with if you have to explain for hours and hours and then you realize it's not a match,
Hmm.
it's very difficult to collaborate. So we make sure that these companies that come together and they think about collaborating, that they already are very much aligned in terms of the value proposition of the startup, and then the problem that is needed to be solved by the company. I think also seeing as like being outsider helps, because you, of course the big companies are paying customers, but in the end we also need to sometimes push them a bit, because they might be too slow, or they might not be attending the meetings, or so we need to be very kind and enable them to succeed,
Hmm.
even if that means um, us reminding them or us pushing them a bit to go out of their comfort zone. And yeah, and then just also implementing best practices, implementing deadlines. I think that's very important, a very basic thing, but it's super important. Because as you know from a design process, technically you can spend eternities with solving a problem in theory, but at some point you need to make a decision that I will now try this out, and giving this timeline can help both parties to have a better collaboration, and setting up clear deliverables, clear expectations from both sides. These are some of the basics that help with bringing these two worlds that are very different together.
Yeah. You mentioned the word enabling, and I think is one of the key actions that design managers take. I work in healthcare, and I think that in the context of healthcare, design managers enable capacity for care, both for patients and for physicians. How do you go about enabling these different, the startup and the corporate, um, the collaboration or the discussion, whatever you are facilitating, or the partnership?
Yeah. I mean, one so it's of course like supporting with all these best practices. And I think one part that we do a bit differently from traditional consulting companies is that we also enable all the companies to learn from each other. So all the companies share the data, they share the successes, the learnings. They meet almost weekly in a call to really go through the project, how it's going. So that's one way we provide this platform for exchange that
Mhm.
already so peer-to-peer exchange in a way. That's one enabler. And then of course also the knowledge that we have learned over time, what makes a collaboration successful, we share that with our companies
Mhm.
and we try to make sure that they implement all of those best practices and that based on our experience enables them to be successful. Yeah, and I think a big enabler is also making sure it's a real problem
Mhm.
where there's real value to be solved. Because if you have a real problem, it and a real valuable problem, everything gets much easier because then people really care about solving it.
Yeah.
That motivation alone is often a huge enabler because if no one is really motivated, like I think all students know that feeling when the group project is not really motivating, then it takes so
Mhm.
long. But if you are motivated and you know why you're doing this, you know the value of it,
Yeah.
and you have some of the tools needed to do it, it becomes much easier and much more fun as well.
You mentioned the word learning. We now have a course, we have a presentation tomorrow that is fostering learning processes. And do you think that in the moment they start engaging in this collaborative learning process together through the sharing of data, through the weekly meetings, that is where the relationships start changing and hence a collaboration?
Um, yeah, so um, I'm not sure I really understand the question, but I think maybe where learning occurs is really um, on different levels. It's
Hmm.
for each company is building the skill set. Then as a network, we are building our skill set, and that is also exchange between the companies. And then in each project, they might be not in those weekly meetings, but they are now doing a pilot. They're testing the startup solution. They're learning how does it feel to work with this small agile company that has such a great technology and such ambitious young people. So there's learning on many different levels.
Hmm.
And I think it's also a constant relearning because in these big organizations, things change all the time. Like
Yeah,
people change, the strategy changes. So it's a lot of relearning as well and educating people that have not been doing this.
yeah.
So so the people change and then you have to relearn it over and over again as well.
But that's a fantastic thing what you would just share because there is no innovation without learning. So if innovation needs to take place, then learning needs to take place. So that it makes a lot of sense that all of them become richer in terms of knowledge and ideas because they are learning together. And when they are learning together, the innovation can take place.
Yeah, and I think they're learning. So we also our companies stay independently or sometimes together with us. We organize a lot of events. So they meet,
Mhm.
they go to each other's factories, for example, for 2 days. They exchange about what they're working on. Or then we have a big event every 3 months, every 4 months, we have an event where all of our companies come together and there's a 2 day event with around 150 to 600 people
Mhm.
where they exchange about what are problems are they working on. And then we have external keynotes from NVIDIA, from Amazon, from world's leading startups,
Mhm.
investors as well, sharing their perspectives. So that's all about learning as well, and
Yeah,
also bringing the right people together to
yeah.
to collaborate, basically.
So in a way, what you do through this networking is to create a community of practice, a group of people that come together.
Yeah.
learn.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's and again, I think the cool thing is that because we do things together with many companies, then there's network effects, right? The more companies we have, the more we can enable this peer learning
yeah,
and the more value everyone gets out of it.
yeah. And that is for me a core skill for design managers. This enabling, as I said before, but also this of fostering learning within organizations so that innovation can take place and foster this community of practices so that they are constantly learning from each other and hence you reduce the chances of getting stuck. Which in today's world, as you were saying, things change so rapidly that you have to, because
Yeah.
otherwise chances are you will run into a difficult situation. We have 3 more minutes to close. How would you like to close? Is there something else you want to share with us? Um,
No, I mean, if there's any more questions, just let me know in the chat. I think I have already talked plenty, so I don't know how much more there is to cover. Of course, there's a lot more to cover, but I think also the attention span might have slipped away at some point, remembering how these long webinars are when I was a student still. Um, yeah, but I think yeah, I think just one last thing I would really encourage to do a master's as well. I know you
mhm,
are well equipped to work already now or soon in an organization, do an internship or graduate and take an entry level job. But I really think that um, academically as well, there's even a lot more growth when you spend a few more years,
mhm,
mostly thinking and doing about a topic.
mhm.
And yeah, we had in our year, I think Guillermina can also advise you well because I think she taught me a lot about different universities and different possibilities. And then also in our year, especially, I don't know how it was after that, but we had quite a few people who went abroad for masters, let's say to um, actually Noah, who is now here in the chat as well, I
Yeah.
think. She went to California, then
Mhm,
Casper went to London, I
mhm.
went to Helsinki, and then someone went to Washington or Seattle.
Yeah,
So
Claire.
there's a yeah, there's a range of different opportunities,
Yeah,
and I would really encourage some of you to do a master's as well.
yeah.
That's
So the alumni are doing masters, and that's something very interesting that particularly those interested in sustainability.
mhm.
Um, Partially because it's very difficult with a 3 year bachelor that you are hired into a position of sustainability. You might be hired to support, but not to lead. And partly because they is one of the most challenging areas, or also the most frustrating. As you said, change in the context of sustainability might be slow, and developing skills to deal with that rhythm or pace or this slowness requires more learning. So many of our students are going into courses or masters that are related to business and sustainability or sustainable transformation. Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It has been a pleasure
Yes,
and very nice also to see the alumni in the list of participants. Thank you for joining.
great. Yeah, thanks everyone, and I guess wishing you a nice evening still.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.